Welcome to Head On here on Shaw TV. I'm your host, Hilary Eastmure. On this show, we take a closer look at some of the issues making news on mid-Vancouver Island. And our topic today is the living wage in Nanaimo and the work that the Ending Poverty Together Coalition is doing. Joined today by Diane Brennan, Councillor for the City of Nanaimo, and John Horn, you're the city's social planner. You're both members of the coalition. It seems a little lopsided having two people from the City of Nanaimo today, but I did reach out to other members, and both of you have extensive histories trying to end poverty in the community. So thank you so much for being here today. Let's start off with how this coalition started and what the goal was when it came together.
Well, we received a bunch of teachers got together and requested that the provincial government do a poverty reduction strategy. Given that the provincial government wasn't inclined to do a poverty reduction strategy, we decided to do one locally, and it was just that simple. So a child poverty reduction strategy came forward as an idea, and a group of citizens got together and said, let's have one of those, and that's really how it started.
And Diane, it's you're part of the committee, but this isn't like directly affiliated with the city.
No, it's not, although the city has asked the province to create a poverty reduction plan too, but that hasn't happened. So
yeah, BC, the only province without a strategy to reduce child poverty.
Yeah.
Okay, so you formed this coalition specifically aimed at ending child poverty, but you have four sort of subsections of the committee in terms of the idea of a living wage, childcare, education, and social inclusion. Okay, so tell me why you wanted to get some numbers about the living wage in Nanaimo.
So the story of child poverty is obviously, it's about parental income. Children don't really control the finances in their homes or generate the income in their homes. So when we began looking at child poverty, we had to start looking at the incomes of parents. And when you look at child poverty in Nanaimo, and indeed in all of Canada, it's mostly a story about people who are working. So there might be a myth that people who are living in poverty, it's because they don't work. What we see is a lot of working families who are still living in poverty, and thus their children are living in poverty. So we began to pay attention not only to those who have no incomes, but to those who actually have small incomes who are struggling along. And that represents a big chunk of people who are living in poverty. So the living wage became an issue because these are people who are working and their wages are not sufficient to keep them and their children out of poverty. And so that was where this discussion started.
And we know and have known for a long time, primarily, I think, from the social planning spark, that families who have two adults working can still fall below the poverty line. So it's not necessarily that people are working part-time or not willing to work hard and full-time. You can work full-time, two parents, and still be raising your children in poverty.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge that we obviously need to overcome. We're looking at the minimum wage here in BC going up to $10.25 an hour, but that's still a far cry when we look at the numbers that we got from the study. So tell me a little bit how you went about finding the living wage rate for the City of Nanaimo.
Well, as you know, it's a provincial and national and international movement to talk about what is the living wage. And many places have done the calculation because there's a set formula that's used to determine how much does it cost to live in Vancouver and Nanaimo. So we approached the provincial body that has done a lot of this work in BC, and we asked them.
Center for Policy Alternatives in BC.
Yes,
okay.
Thanks. And we asked them for the formula. How do you actually calculate a living wage for a community? They have a set formula. It's quite exhaustive. You have to do a lot of work. So we asked our partners up in the Parksville-Qualicum Oceanside area. They've done this calculation for that District 69. And so we asked them to help us because it's a tremendous amount of math and you really have to be quite rigorous. And so they helped us through these calculations and with kudos to the District 69 Living Wage Committee. Without them, we would be struggling. But they helped us and we were able to complete the calculations to determine a living wage for Nanaimo.
Okay,
They've
Diane.
been very active, the Living Wage Group in Parksville. So
Yes.
they really set a standard for us to be able to work towards, and they have been to our meetings, they've helped us, they've organized lots of information for us. So kudos to them.
Yeah, that's great that we have that sort of cooperation. Imagine if we did that on a provincial scale. Okay, so what number did we come up with for the living wage, Diane?
17 for Nanaimo Ladysmith. It's $17.99, is it?
Yeah.
Is that?
So
yes.
right around $18.
Absolutely,
Wow.
yes.
Okay, and I mean, how
Considerably
that
more.
stacks up. It definitely makes sense with the communities around us. In Parksville, it was $17.66, and Port Alberni is $17.22. Metro Vancouver is obviously higher, $20.68 an hour, but still, that's a lot of money to be making an hour. I don't think many people are making that wage per hour unless you're working in a high-skilled trade or something.
Yeah, you're correct. And so it does imply that people who are not making that and raising a family, that they're having to make some concessions along the way or some sacrifices along the way. That what they are would probably be individual to each family, but it can tell you that all the data we use to calculate the living wage, none of it's extraneous saving for a university education or holidays or none of those
kids
kind of
playing
additional
hockey.
ancillary
Vacation
things.
funds, nothing like
Wow. Okay. So
Really, there's no fluff in this calculation. So, yeah.
So it includes the cost of rent,
Yeah.
clothing, food, and childcare.
and transportation, I think, too. doesn't it?
Okay.
Yep.
Yes.
Transportation and clothing and footwear, because you have to feed and clothe your kids, right?
And that's if you had two parents, both working, raising two children.
Yep.
You
Okay.
would need essentially $18 an hour from both.
Yeah.
So $36 an hour coming into the family.
Yep.
Wow.
35 hours a week.
So when you look at that, it's no wonder that we have such a high rate of child poverty, in BC and in Nanaimo. Recently, the BC Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition released a number. This is data from 2013 before the riding boundary shifted, but it showed that Nanaimo Cowichan had the highest level of child poverty in BC, 28.2%.
And that's not new. We've had that rate of poverty for years and years. And
Yeah, so we're
it's,
not, there's
it's
been no
not some-
progress.
That's right. And there's not something that's sort of taken us by surprise. We've known that. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we're working so hard to try to change that and not wait for other levels of government necessarily.
One of
Yeah.
the things that number tells you, and the consistency of that number, is it's a structural poverty issue. In other words, this is not a transitory, one family's having a bad time. It's consistent in our landscape again and again and again. So in order to resolve that, we're not going to do that by helping a family. Clearly, there's other deeper things that we have to do if we want to begin to minimize the amount of child poverty in our community, and that's really what's driving this group. Is we have to get at deeper pieces, the wages people are paid, the child care costs they're incurring, and less about the individual and their capacities. So.
Yeah, and it's important that we have these numbers so that we can, have a jumping off point for some of the conversations that we obviously need to have at a municipal level. And then, when we reach out to the province, I guess we need to have these numbers to say this is almost unattainable for a family to be making, with both parents making almost $18 an hour. Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about what the city can do to get a little bit closer to this living wage and reduce child poverty. Welcome back to Head On here on Shaw TV. We're talking today about Nanaimo's living wage and how we can end child poverty in Nanaimo. Joined today by Councillor Diane Brennan and John Horan, Nanaimo's social planner. You're both members of the Ending Poverty Together coalition. Both have a long history of fighting poverty. Diane, before you were a councillor, you were a poverty paralegal and also created courses to train people on how to connect people living in poverty with the resources they need to.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
right. And correct them if there's been mistakes made and preserve their shelter, their homes. Those kinds of issues are important to people who live in poverty.
Yeah, absolutely. So before the break, we were talking about how the coalition did crunch the numbers and came up with $17.99 an hour. That's how much a parent would need to make to raise a family with two children if both parents are working. So that's an interesting number, but it might be a little bit confusing for people because also, we had the vital signs study that came out recently, or the report for Nanaimo, and that has a different definition of a living wage. That's sort of based on an individual income, and in that case, a living wage is considered $20,000 before tax, and otherwise you're living below the poverty line. So the living wage is not an uncontroversial number because it's different for depending on
Different
singles in
yes.
different communities. Yeah. So we're trying to end child poverty, but we're seeing that children don't have any control over their situation, and they need the parents to make a living wage. Here in Nanaimo, it's evident that we have issues with poverty. In that Vital Signs report, the people who did the survey gave Nanaimo a D+ in the gap between the rich and the poor. So,
I think it's a fair evaluation of how tough it is. And yes, there are a lot of families and individuals in Nanaimo who do live in very reduced circumstances. And as a community, we've struggled with this for years. And this is our kind of latest and strongest attempt to change that.
okay, so we've got these numbers to back up our argument and to prove that we need to do better.
Yeah.
And now it's a matter of coming up with some strategies, and I guess that's where your job comes in as social planner. There's a lot of pressure on you to help spearhead some of these things. But
luckily, I have 165 friends who are helping me with this particular project.
Yes.
So, and one of the things we did was we looked at, well, what areas can we affect locally? There's things that provincial and federal governments could do, but we really wanted to focus on those things that we could actually accomplish without having to involve our senior government partners. So we chose 4 domains, including the living wage. One of the things we think is that for Nanaimo employers, we know that not all of them are able to pay $18 an hour. Their business model might not support that. But we're hoping that they can take in mind that as they look to what they want to pay their staff, if they have aspirations about bringing their staff up into a living wage, that at least they know what that number is. So we've been contacted by employers who've asked, what is the living wage in Nanaimo? And we can tell them it's $17.99. They can go back to their own shops and look at, can we get our staff up to that level? That's the fair place we want them to be so that they come to work healthy, their children are in childcare, their needs are met, so I've got good productive employees in my shop. I need to sort of hit $18 an hour so that I know they can live without being stressed out and going to the food bank. So it's a way for employers to give it aspire towards, and we know that not everyone's going to get there, but at least they have a benchmark that says, here's what I should be trying to shoot for with my staff if I want them to live comfortably here in Nanaimo.
One of the probably obvious things is that the costs that people have, if those change, then the living wage can be ratcheted down. So that if childcare wasn't such a major expense for families, then the living wage wouldn't have to be as high as that. So efforts to make childcare more affordable, easier to find, are going to really impact that living wage calculation as well.
The calculation, if I may, is that if you provided childcare at $10 a day for every citizen in Nanaimo, then your living wage becomes not $18 an hour, but $14 an hour. So it's a substantial $4 an hour difference by providing $10 a day childcare, because it eats up such a big chunk of family budgets that there's a tremendous effect on how much you have to earn.
could we do that in Nanaimo?
By ourselves, without our provincial and federal partners, I would suggest no. It's too big a ticket.
We don't have that kind of money to subsidize. But we can do things about childcare, and that's one of our subgroups.
That's right.
And that is to work on ways of making sure that there's childcare spaces in neighborhoods that need it. And in those ways, the city can have an effect by when we approve new housing developments, that we look to the developer for amenities such as childcare centers. Not that they would run themselves, but that there would be space within that condominium where a child minding or childcare facility could exist.
When I spoke to the mayor, he also mentioned that affordable housing is something that he'd like to see Nanaimo really move forward on. We have money in our housing fund to help make that happen, and that would definitely help some families. If you're living below the poverty line, you'd be eligible for something like that, and people spend a huge chunk of their income on rent.
Yeah, I'll give council credit. As of Monday night, they provided an initial seed grant of $45,000 to help us with the rent supplement program to do exactly as you speak. Not everyone's going to move into home ownership, but we know that a lot of people rent, and the difference between what they take in and what they're obliged to pay in rent is a very stressful difference, in some cases unbridgeable.
Yeah.
So we're going to put together a program for the people who are currently struggling with homelessness to supplant their income assistance check with enough money so they can pay a rent in a private sector apartment. And again, that affordable housing piece, sometimes you can make a subsidized unit available to somebody, so the provincial or federal government will pay for that. But a lot of times we're going to have to look to getting a regular old apartment and just finding a way to help that person bridge the financial gap between what they earn and what the apartment actually costs to rent.
And people who are struggling with that may very well have children. It's, you know, not just single
for
people who
sure.
are struggling with homelessness in our community. Okay. And Diane, what else do you think the city can do sort of in the short term, next 5 years, to try to take a dent out of the child poverty rates?
Well, I think I think one of the most important things that we don't necessarily always think of when we're talking about poverty or child poverty, and that's the cost of transportation and the availability of transportation. Is people require transportation to get to jobs. I mean, one of the things that we need to remember is that if you're making less than $18 an hour, you might not be in a position to buy a vehicle. And so we need to have transportation available and subsidized to the degree that people can afford it, and make sure that it goes into neighborhoods and that there's routes that take them to places where they work. And that's a big one, and I know that I've spoken to people about that, and that's one of the obstacles to actually finding work.
Yeah. I can add, if I may, that if you look at the calculations for the living wage, you'll see that food comprises 15% of the average family's budget. So we have been working actively with the local food bank to enhance the quantity and quality of fresh food available to folks who are not able to purchase it from their own resources. So again, we can start to look at some of those, things like food and shelter costs, and if we can help people minimize those costs, then in effect we're helping their wage go a little further.
And we do have a huge number of people using the food bank in Nanaimo. 2014, there was more than 61,000 food bank visits. I think that's a staggering number, and they, they help over 1,000 children. So, yeah, and we've become very reliant on the food bank. Can you imagine the situation we would be in?
Yes.
Yeah. Without that, we'd have a lot of hungry people.
Yeah.
There was community conversations in the 80s about whether we should have food banks or whether we should make them into nonprofits. And the thinking at that time was, if we do that, we're going to institutionalize food banks, and there'll never be an impetus to change that. We are so far beyond even having those discussions anymore. Food banks are essential facilities for people to be able to feed their families, but also there's oftentimes added services like food or clothing tables, those kinds of things. Absolutely essential. No longer do we talk about whether we should have them.
Yeah, I can't, it must be very tough as a parent to be working full-time, have your partner working full-time and still not being able to put any money away for your kids' education. I can't imagine that stress.
I mean, there's been some changes, like the cost of real estate, for example. Wages have stayed relatively flat in terms of the last 2 decades, but other costs have risen dramatically. Heating costs, housing costs, transportation costs, childcare costs. So the poor wage earner, our wages kind of stay the same, but all the other things go up. And so we're seeing that stretch, and that's that gap between rich and poor, which is really showing up in our town.
And the John uses the term structural poverty and structural reasons for it. And if you are living in poverty and you're struggling every day, and you know that you can't put aside money for your child's education, and education is one of the routes out of poverty. Sure. And so that's how things become structural. That's how things last for as long as I've been involved in the anti-poverty work. So the corresponding reduction in hope for families it must be staggering to them. And so for me, that's really the impetus for continuing to be in this work, is to change that underlying fundamental reason why people are poor.
Yeah. The other piece that we've talked about with our coalition is that when children live in poverty, they're not necessarily aware of the financial, some kids might be, but most kids grow up kind of oblivious to their parents' financial lives. So we felt that the experience of poverty for a young child is not, oh, my parent only makes X number of dollars, they should make more, but more like, I don't get to go on the ski trip with the other kids. So they experience poverty a little bit different than a parent does. So one of our thrusts is to look at, maybe we can't necessarily help a family generate more income, but what if we can lessen the experience of being poor for the children in that family? So we have a subgroup that focuses on that. So if you can't go on the ski trip because your family doesn't make enough, if we found a way to get you on that ski trip, your experience of poverty isn't the same anymore. You still get to participate fully with your peers in the things that they do. So yes, your family may be poor, but you know how to ski just like the rich kid does. So that's really part of that gap. Isn't always economics, it's the experience that the children have, and helping them have a good experience, even if there's no money, begins to blunt the effects of poverty on the next generation, and that's really key.
What about the health effects of living in poverty? Because children, their development may be delayed. Maybe they don't have access to dental care, vision care, that kind of thing, and then it sets them up for a cycle of, like you said, this ingrained cycle of poverty.
Yeah, that's really, I think, a factor that we don't often think about, but one that really hits kids and their families, and just the parents' inability to change that for their child. That's really the depression and health starts to become affected. And I think Dr. Hasselbeck is really, he's the chief medical officer for the region, has really started to tackle that and really started to challenge the institutions in Nanaimo to try to change that. He certainly has challenged council to pay attention to those things.
Okay. So what do you think is the sort of the next step that we need to take now that we know the living wage in Nanaimo, $17.99 an hour for two parents to raise two healthy kids, and plenty of other people without children still living in poverty, not making a living wage. Step one might be attracting more jobs to Nanaimo, more high-paying jobs.
I think that's a major step.
Sure.
Yeah, we've got an economic summit happening right now.
Correct, yeah.
We've got the mayor heading to China to look for, investors to come back to Nanaimo. So, there's a lot of transitions happening in our job market.
Yeah.
I think concentrating or partnering with the university on activities like the trip to China. Dr. Nilsson has said he will help us in any way that the university can, and they have a very strong program of international education and moving, going into other countries. So those are things that we can do.
Yeah, and I really, what I like about your coalition, it's the Ending Poverty Together coalition. It's not like that coalition is going to end poverty. It's we really need to work as a whole, as a community, to break down some of these barriers.
And as you can tell from tonight, there's a number of threads. So no one group's going to be able to tackle every thread anyhow. So you have to kind of do a multi-pronged approach to these substantive, rooted issues. No one bullet, magic bullet, so to speak, will go. So there's about 20 different things you have to do, 20 different ways at the same time, and then you can begin to move the needle, so to speak, nudge the needle.
I think Nanaimo as a community is really good at this kind of stuff, at working together. It's we had an experience, say 10 years ago, where there was a movement to form together the airport, the university, the city, the Port Authority, and to say, okay, what do we want for our community? What can we agree? And we took those ideas among the group of us and pushed them forward, and we got money for the airport, for expanding the airport. The university is second to none, really. And we got money for the museum, so we're good at that. I think maybe because it's been hard for us to get additional funding, so we acknowledge that we've got to do it by grouping together.
Okay. All right, any final comments, John?
I would invite anyone who's interested in poverty in Nanaimo, and specifically child poverty, who wishes to be a part of changing that. I would invite them to contact myself or Councillor Brennan to see how they can be a part of the work that we're doing, and we would welcome that participation.
And once we help the kids, you know, everybody's boat rises with the tide.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Rising tide.
Okay. And Diane, any final comments to add?
No, I just want to thank John because he is pretty amazing in terms of this stuff. You think
We are lucky to have a social planner.
We
in
are
Nanaimo,
very
actually.
lucky to have a
Yeah.
social planner, and we have.
I'm lucky to have a social planning job. That's
Yeah, yeah. No. He's got several champions in the community, so not just John, but the function of a social planner. People want that. They appreciate it. So
need it.
yes, we do.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the work that both of you are doing, and I'll be closely watching the coalition and looking forward to the next steps. Okay, thanks for being here. And of course, thank you for watching Head On today, and a big thank you to all of the wonderful volunteers who get the show on the air every week.